Sometimes the happiest day of a bride's life
Stay away from me!
is when the groom is dead. A Christian mom gives a helping hand for murder.
I want him dead.
She was offering $5,000 to $15,000.
I said I needed them.
A policeman's wife takes the law into her own hands.
Domestic violence frequently ends in death.
And a military bride does anything to escape divorce.
God help the next man who has a relationship with her.
Memphis, Tennessee, 1985.
Lord, help me see with your eyes.
Sundays are a day of worship for the Owens family. Morning and night, they go to church. 32-year-old Gail is in the choir.
She did appear to be the perfect mother. I mean, she sang in the church. She took care of 2 sons.
Her 37-year-old husband, Ron, is a respected member of the congregation.
Ron Owens was very active in church as well. He would stay after church on Sunday to coach basketball.
Their 2 sons love helping Dad.
Oh, that was beautiful, ladies. Congratulations. I'm just going to train, all right, the boys come?
Her and her husband had essentially the image of a perfect relationship.
Just make sure you're not late for dinner, right?
Gail looked like a devoted wife and mother. Took care of her family, involved with the church.
The Christian mom is often on missions in some of Memphis's poorest and toughest areas.
A suburban mother driving around some of the meanest streets of Memphis. She stuck out like a sore thumb.
It's predominantly black, and she's a white lady in a fancy car.
Gail is handing out cash to the poor.
She was offering thousands of dollars.
Here.
Her nickname in the neighborhood became Big Money.
But her generosity is causing her family to go broke.
Bills started coming back unpaid.
Gail wasn't paying the bills, she was hiding them. Debts were piling up.
Finished for the day?
Yes, I am.
Well, you have a lovely evening.
Ron has no idea what his wife's up to. It's not the first time she's kept a secret. For a number of years, Gail embezzled money from her employers. And not just the petty cash.
She embezzled somewhere around $60,000.
Gail's excuse for this was saying that it would ease financial pressure on her husband. In fact, it made financial pressure exist where it hadn't been there before.
Ron only finds out about his wife's thieving ways
What's going on, Gail?
It'll be all right, Ron.
when Gail's arrested. She's convicted of 35 counts of forgery.
Not only did she have to pay back the money, she was fined. Now the family was under financial strain.
Ron mortgages the house and uses their savings to pay Gail's debt to society.
Mommy!
After serving 60 days in jail, Gail comes home to a frosty welcome.
I'm going out.
Come on now, and I'll tell you all about it. Okay.
There are questions about how much friction the embezzlement case and other debts had on their relationship.
Publicly, Ron stands by his wife. Privately, the hospital nursing administrator is mortified by Gail's crimes.
That ended up being a serious problem for the couple. He was angry, he was ashamed.
Close the door.
But Ron has a shameful secret of his own.
Lock it.
Ron had been having an affair with a woman at work.
Despite Outward's appearance of being a very happy couple, there were secrets. Her husband had been having an affair, we're told, with somebody at work.
The affair isn't as secret as Ron thinks. Gail is on to them. She follows her husband to work.
Gail realized that her husband was having an affair and confronted him about it.
Proud of yourself?
She actually caught him with his mistress in a parking lot.
How dare you?
How dare you?
Furious at his betrayal, Gail won't turn the other cheek.
She went to confront him, and she's alleged that he slapped her.
You monster!
They actually may have been headed to divorce because of this and other issues.
Gail fears divorce will cost her more than a husband. She'll lose her meal ticket. And because she's a jailbird, custody of her 2 sons.
I would say things were about as bad as they could get in the Owens household, but I'd be wrong. They were about to get a lot worse. She became desperate.
On the surface, Ron and Gail Owens appear to have the perfect relationship. Living in the middle-class city of Bartlett, Memphis. Until tragedy. Ron is the victim of a brutal home invasion.
Robbery seemed like it was a plausible motive in that he didn't seem to have any enemies at the time. He was well-liked in the community and active, so there's no reason to think that anybody would have wanted him to be murdered.
The attack stuns the community. Violent crime is rare here.
When this murder happened, it was the second murder that they know of being recorded.
Nothing is stolen, and Ron has no known enemies. It's a baffling case. Until police get a call from the other side of town.
A few days later, when a man named George James came forward and said that Gail Owens had offered him money to kill her husband.
George tells them a crazy tale of a white woman armed with cash, trolling the mean streets of Memphis, looking for a hitman.
She drove around for months, in fact, approaching groups of young men.
Gail thinks the right cash can turn any stranger
I want him dead.
into a killer.
How much?
5,000.
I'm gonna need some money. I'm gonna need some money up front.
There were several men who ostensibly took her up on the offer, but essentially scammed her. She was offering thousands of dollars, and there were people who said sure, and then she never heard from them again.
She was a laughingstock. They took her money, though.
Gail is conned out of thousands of dollars, but she doesn't give up.
She ran out of money, but that didn't deter her. She was bound and determined to find someone to kill her husband, and eventually she did.
This is the house.
42-year-old Sydney Porterfield
Then follow me in through
is willing to murder now and be paid later.
When do I get paid?
when his life insurance comes through.
How much?
He had quite a background in criminal history and assaults and other things.
Ron's death will make Gail a wealthy widow.
Gail Owens stood to gain $115,000 from Ron Owens' life insurance policy.
It's nice dribbling, Brian. Come on, Steve, take defense. Go, shoot, go. Oh, nice. Go, boy.
February 17th, 1985. Like every other Sunday, the Owens family go to church.
Mom, can't we do basketball practice with Dad?
No, not tonight.
Oh, please.
Why not?
But after the service, Gail changes their routine.
Come on, Gail.
The two boys always liked to watch Ron play basketball. And that particular night, she wouldn't let them watch and made them go with her to her sister's house.
Tonight, she wants Ron home alone to greet her paid guest.
So that night, Ron parked his car in his driveway, walked into the house, is attacked from behind by Sidney Porterfield.
Ron is ambushed with a tire iron.
There was probably 26 plus blows to the back of his head. It was hit so hard it appeared that you would have taken a small hand axe and hit somebody in the back of the head. That's how split open it was.
Incredibly, Ron clings to life.
Dad?
When Gail and her two sons return home later that night, she lets the 11-year-old lead the way.
She had her son go into the house. Of course, he found his dad in the floor, and that's when the police were called.
Ron actually lingered for a few hours before actually dying at the hospital.
I'm not sure which is worse, having her husband killed or allowing one of her children to find his father's body.
After months of planning, Gail is finally a wealthy widow. But her celebrations are short-lived.
I want him dead.
One of her would-be hitmen is telling all.
When he told us that she had tried to hire him, we had him call her, and he told her that she didn't give him some money. He was going to the Bartlett police.
George plays the lead in a sting.
Look, you don't need to know anything else.
When Gail gives him money for his silence, every word is caught on tape.
Why'd you kill your husband?
Look, we just had a bad 13 years, okay?
The game's up, and she knows it.
Well, she confessed to paying to have him murdered. There was no emotion during her statement, from what I understand.
This is none of your business.
Gail claims the day Ron slapped her sealed his fate.
You monster!
She said that that incident is what led her to take to the streets of Memphis and look for someone to kill her husband.
Gail gives up Sidney Porterfield. He's convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. In 1986, Gail Owens is convicted of accessory to first-degree murder. She, too, is sentenced to death.
Gail underestimated everyone.
How much?
5,000.
I think she really believed that anyone in the black community would be happy to take her money and kill and keep their mouth shut, and she was completely wrong.
After 26 years on death row, Gail's sentence is commuted to life. In 2011, she is granted parole. To the surprise of many, waiting outside the prison is her son.
At some point, Stephen decided that he couldn't hold on to this anger anymore and that he needed to forgive her. To this day, they're nearly inseparable.
I don't think society needs to be very nervous about Gail Owens living among them. Most people serving time in prison for murder had one specific person they wanted to kill, and they did it for what they believed was one important reason. Gail falls into that category.
is she? I want to know who she is.
And there's nobody.
Yes, there is. Now you tell me who she is.
Every home has secrets.
People around them started seeing these cracks.
$500 on clothes.
Some about everyday life.
They argued a lot about Kim's spending.
Others are unthinkable.
Stay away from me.
I wished he'd left and taken the kids at that point.
Calexico takes its name from its location, the border of California and Mexico.
It's a rural area, extremely impoverished. The population is predominantly Hispanic.
In 2006, new residents come to town, the Cano family. 37-year-old Kim convinces her husband Frank to leave Los Angeles for the desert life. They move to the upscale side of town.
They purchased a 5-bedroom home in a brand new subdivision.
The couple is raising 4 children. They're 3, and Kim's teenage daughter from her first marriage.
Pass. Frank basically was just best husband. He would just go to work, come home, dedicated his time to his kids and his wife.
But people around them started seeing these cracks.
I've got chores for you.
Yes, boss.
Everybody had to do what she said, and they better hop to it.
Frank lets her run the house. But one thing he won't give up is the job he loves as a California Highway Patrol officer, even though that means a 400-mile round trip to and from work.
Kim insisted that they move 3 hours away from where Frank worked. I don't know what she was thinking.
It's a sacrifice Frank makes to keep Kim happy.
It made it really rough on Frank. Now he had to work a night shift and swing shift, and it really messed up his sleeping habits.
Frank gave her everything within his power to give. A home, beautiful children, amenities, love, affection.
Is that perfume?
Kim, don't start.
But Kim suspects his true affection lies elsewhere.
She suspected Francisco was possibly having an extramarital affair in Los Angeles.
Frank denies cheating, but admits he has a close female friend at work.
She accused Frank of having an affair. He said, no, she's just a friend. And that Frank was a very friendly guy. But from that point on, Kim was very suspicious about him.
There is another problem in the home. Kim's spending.
What's this? $500 on clothes, $200 on a purse.
I needed them.
Frank had a pretty good salary insofar as being a trooper. It was never enough for Kim. But I think if Frank had made $1 million a minute, it wouldn't have been enough for Kim.
This has got to stop.
During the course of those arguments, their children actually saw her physically lash out against him.
Frank keeps the abuse a secret.
I wanted to confide in you.
Kim doesn't.
Frank's been beating her. Not Frank.
Kim said that Frank was verbally and physically abusing her.
Kim, what's wrong?
Stay away from me!
Everyone that knew Frank described him as a great guy. Kim described him as an alcoholic and abusive. I think Kim saw every man that way.
Calexico, Southern California.
I've just driven over 200 miles.
Highway Patrol Officer Frank Kano is always exhausted from long shifts, miles of travel, and arguments at home. Now his wife Kim is out to smear him.
I need you to come over.
She calls his work supervisor.
Frank was painting the bedroom. She said he was doing a sloppy job. She said, Frank's been drinking, he's been yelling at me, he's made a mess here.
I don't know what Kim was thinking, because if a law enforcement officer is convicted of domestic abuse, they cannot carry a gun. If they cannot carry a gun, they cannot be a law enforcement officer. I don't know what Kim thought was going to happen to that paycheck.
See? He's a mess.
Hey, buddy.
You here to help?
When Kim left, the supervisor said, Frank, maybe you better get marriage counseling.
They never get a chance to visit a counselor.
Oh, please hurry! I didn't know the cup was open. I didn't know.
Just days later, on December 4th, 2006.
He's gone.
No!
Frank is dead, the victim of a terrible accident.
No!
Kim says it should be her lying dead. She was about to end her own life when Frank tried to stop her.
Now, Kim says she's so fed up, she's had it. She's going to get that gun and commit suicide. Frank comes into the room.
Stay away from me!
Kim says she's frightened. She says he's angry. She aims the gun up at the ceiling, she says, closes her eyes and takes a shot. It hits Frank in the eye and kills him.
Detective Julio Diaz starts investigating Kim's story and finds the couple has been constantly fighting, or at least one of them has.
Kim could fly off the handle at times. She had kind of a short fuse.
Stay away from me!
At family get-togethers, Kim would launch into uncontrollable attacks against Francisco.
Stay away from me!
She threatened to stab him with a kitchen knife in the middle of an argument in front of their older daughter.
I want to know who she is.
There's nobody.
Yes, there is. Now you tell me who she is.
Their children tell a tale of spousal abuse by Kim.
Well, why don't I just shoot you then?
Well, go ahead and do it. See what happens.
She remembers Kim telling Frank, well, how about if I just shoot you? And then he said, well, go ahead and do it and see what happens.
Mom, Dad.
Detective Diaz starts to realize the Kanos' lives aren't exactly how Kim portrays them. And then there's her story of the shooting.
Stay away from me!
She was just trying to scare him, so she shot him in the air.
Forensic ballistics reveal the shot that kills Frank is carefully aimed at one place.
Her gun was at basically her face level. And I mean, it was pointing right at his face. There's no way that it was pointing at the ceiling because it wouldn't have hit. his face.
Kim Kano goes to trial for murder, and prosecutors make their case. The day Frank is killed, he's writing a love letter to his wife.
Frank! Frank!
She called out to him.
I need you up here.
He abruptly got up from the kitchen table and went upstairs to see what the problem was.
The problem is an angry wife with a loaded gun.
What's wrong?
Frank must have been astonished to see his own gun pointed at him like that. It must have been just horrifying.
Kim claims the gun goes off by accident.
She said it felt like a piece of paper when she pulled the trigger, but a ballistics expert testified that it actually took 12 pounds of force to pull the trigger.
Did your father yell at your mom?
Adding to the weight of evidence, her children testify against her.
Did you see anyone get hit?
Yes, sir. Mom hit Dad.
They'd lost their father. They knew if they testified against their mother and she was found guilty, she'd be going to prison. They'd be losing her, too.
Yes, sir. Mom hit Dad.
They must have believed she belonged in prison. They also might have been very afraid of her. If she can kill Dad, she can kill me.
In 2010, Kim Kano is found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years to life.
Kim never confessed she had to be in the right. She could not admit that she'd done wrong.
Everyone loved Frank Kano, except his wife. But why did she kill him?
Greed. She was the beneficiary of a life insurance policy that paid the balance of their debt in the event of his accidental death. And frustration, because he wasn't able to provide her with the lifestyle that she felt he should be able to provide her with.
Kim's narcissistic ways steal a good father from his children.
Frankie said, I would never be able to see another football game with my father again. That really bothered me. That really hurt.
I think Frank felt that being a cop was enough to keep her from seriously hurting him. Sadly, he was wrong.
In the silence of darkness,
Around 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, Taishi got up.
a young woman's life changes forever.
She was in the bathroom.
She didn't see or hear anybody. She just heard a gunshot.
A tragic mystery to a life that started with such promise.
It's just abhorrent. And grew up in San Diego, California. He joined the military after he finished high school, and he had never been to Killeen, Texas until he was stationed there at Fort Hood.
Here in 1996, opposites attract. Carefree local party girl, 17-year-old Taishi Grant, catches the soldier's eye.
You want to marry him? She didn't really have a whole lot of ambition, but Taishi was a lot of fun to be around.
Gary came from a good family, graduated high school, and he didn't do drugs. The exact opposite of Taishi and her friends.
What's your name?
Tashi.
But Gary can't resist Taishi's charms.
Gary was new in the area. He didn't know anyone. He was probably a bit lonely being away from his family.
Romance blossoms, and in a whirlwind, there are wedding bells.
It's not unusual in Colleen to go ahead and make it official and be married, and then they can get the benefits from the military.
You know what I like waking up to?
I'm surprised there.
Military accommodation, medical insurance, a comfortable life. By marrying Gary, Taishi's fortunes instantly change.
She must have seen Gary as someone who could give her something that she didn't have.
And nothing cements a new marriage like a baby.
What's me?
You're gonna be daddy.
At first, the relationship seemed to be going well. Gary might have thought there were no problems initially, but it was a little different for Taishi.
Taishi hasn't really thought this through. Life as a stay-at-home military mom
Taishi?
is not Taishi's idea of a good time.
How can you live like this?
You don't like it? You get it.
She's just the kind of person that didn't care to be a responsible mom. Old food, laying around, dirty carpet, clothes everywhere. Just the kind of house that most people would not want to live in.
And you're going out?
Oh, and she needs a diaper changed.
To Taishi, Gary looked good. He offered a life she wanted, but not really.
She wanted to do what she wanted to do. Taishi liked to party.
She didn't really want to leave her friends and her druggy lifestyle behind.
Taishi leaves Gary holding the baby, while she plays around with an old high school sweetheart, 18-year-old Jacob Harris.
That was what she really wanted.
She was more committed to hanging out with her gang friends and her drug friends. Jacob Harris was one of them, her boyfriend. And that's what led to the animosity between her and Gary.
Just a year into the marriage, Gary has had enough.
Want to be a college boy?
Taishi and her husband decided to divorce.
Gary plans to move back home to California.
Maybe it's best if you don't come back.
Damn right.
I think to Taishi, Gary represented a meal ticket. There's really no indication she ever even loved him.
Gary's not only leaving Taishi, he's leaving the Army and losing all the benefits of being a soldier.
You divorce him, you won't get nothing.
When he left the Army, his health benefits would end. In addition to that, he would no longer have the $200,000 life insurance policy. And Taishi decided, well, it's time to get something from him before he goes.
I'd be better off an army widow, wouldn't I?
When Taishi figured this all out, I think she set a date for his murder.
Killeen, Texas, 1998. 18 months after their wedding, 22-year-old husband Gary and his 19-year-old wife Taishi Prokop plan their divorce.
So she can stay with me at Easter?
Yep, if I have her for Christmas.
Yeah, sounds fair.
And the future of their baby daughter.
They had sat down and written a custody agreement, and it appeared that Gary had every intention of being a good father. He wanted custody on certain holidays, and this agreement laid out exactly when he would get her and when Taishi would get her, what financial arrangements they would have, and what Gary would pay for.
There's only one arrangement Taishi doesn't like.
Gary was planning on leaving the service. That would have meant an end to his regular Army paycheck, as well as that $200,000 life insurance policy.
She isn't interested in being a divorcee. Taishi wants to be a widow.
She wanted that money. She saw that as an opportunity for her to do other things.
All right, so coming through here, this is the lounge room.
With her lover, 20-year-old Jacob Harris, and 2 willing friends, Taishi plans Gary's demise.
What shocks me is how easy it was for her boyfriend Jacob to find people to help him do it. It's just abhorrent.
20-year-old Charles Chucky Turnbull will be the gunman. 19-year-old Rodney Barfield, the getaway driver.
And I'll be out of town.
Jacob gives himself the perfect alibi.
He left and went to Missouri. How can I be involved in a crime? I'm in Missouri, I'm out of state.
In the early hours of June 25th, 1998, Taishi seals Gary's fate.
Around 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, Taishi got up, went to the front door and unlocked it. Chucky came into the house.
Taishi retreats to the bathroom, leaving her sleeping husband an easy target.
Chucky fired an assault rifle 1 time right into Gary's head and ended his life just like that.
The murder of Gary Prokop was mercifully quick and painless. He was shot in the head while he was sleeping and never knew what happened.
To complete the plan, Taishi needs to play a shocked bystander.
The story that she relayed was that she was in the bathroom. She didn't see or hear anybody. She just heard a gunshot. She was scared and she fled the house.
Help! Help!
She just ran straight to her neighbors and called 911.
Send the police! Someone shot my husband!
But Taishi is a bad actor.
Someone shot my husband! Send help!
She was a suspect right away.
Someone shot my husband! Send help!
It sounded in the 911 call as though she was trying to force herself to cry or to sound like she was crying, but officers on the scene said that she wasn't crying at all, that they never saw tears.
There's another red flag for investigators.
She forgot to bring her baby with her. What kind of mother would leave their baby in danger? Taishi did, because she knew her baby was not in danger.
But despite their suspicions, the police lack direct evidence, and for 3 years, Taishi gets away with murder.
Everybody thought that her story probably was not legitimate, but they had nothing to go on.
Then Sergeant Patrick Turk gets a break in the case, thanks to a police informant.
One of my sources came to me at one point and said that he had information about this Prokop murder that had occurred in 1998, and he wanted to talk to me about it.
The informant leads police to the getaway driver, Rodney Barfield.
It was Taishi's idea. Chucky was the shooter.
Filled with remorse, he cracks.
I was the driver.
Over the course of about 5 hours, he confessed his full involvement in the crime. He cried as he confessed.
You got the gun?
Yeah.
He detailed all the roles of all the individual players in the crime.
The more co-conspirators you have in any plan, eventually someone's gonna crack.
Their house of cards collapses. Facing the death penalty, Taishi accepts a plea.
The evidence was pretty compelling, but she never admitted her involvement in the crime, other than to accept a guilty plea.
All the co-defendants are convicted. Charles Turnbull of capital murder. Jacob Harris and Rodney Barfield of conspiracy to commit capital murder.
He obviously had remorse about the crime, and yet he got sucked up into helping out with it, and he's going to be spending most of his life in prison.
In 2003, Taishi Prokop pleads guilty to capital murder and is sentenced to life in prison. She is eligible for parole in 2032.
Taishi is exactly where she belongs, and I hope she stays there for the rest of her life.
A young man's bright future is cut short.
Just the senseless death of a soldier, unrelated to combat. He was a good dad. He was a good soldier. He was loved by his family.
What's your name?
Because he married the wrong woman.
Taishi had little education and no career at the time she killed her husband. But a lot of women fall into that category, and they don't get featured on Deadly Women.
These deadly women betrayed the most intimate trust. Gail Owens contracted out her husband's murder. Kim Kano took the law into her own hands. And Taishi Prokop's greed cost a young soldier his life. All three women killed those they vowed to love. For these brides, wedded bliss was to have and to kill.
At 3:17 a.m., the phone rang in a quiet Sydney house where nothing ever happened, and when it stopped ringing, nothing in that house would ever be the same again. Because somewhere between the last echo of the dial tone and the first breath taken by a man who did not yet know he was about to become a suspect, a life had already slipped into the category the newspapers would later call a cold case. A phrase that sounds clinical until you realize it means years of silence, unanswered questions, and a community learning how to live with a wound that never closes. In the winter of 1992, Sydney was wrapped in the kind of cold that seeps through brick and bone, and on a narrow street not far from the harbor, police cars idled with their lights off. Officers stepping carefully across wet pavement, as if the ground itself might remember what happened if disturbed too roughly. Inside the house, the air was heavy, stale, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and something sharper underneath, something no one wanted to name out loud. The victim lay where she had fallen, not staged, not posed, just still, as if the night had simply pressed pause and forgotten to press play again. Neighbors gathered behind tape, whispering fragments of information that did not yet fit together, eyes darting toward windows they had looked through 1,000 times without ever really seeing. This was the moment when a normal street became a crime scene, when a family name became something spoken more softly, when a year, 1992, began to carry weight. Detectives moved through the room slowly, methodically, their notebooks filling with details that would later be argued over, dismissed, rediscovered, elevated to breakthroughs, then quietly shelved again. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no dramatic trail of blood leading to an obvious answer, just the unnerving implication that whoever had done this knew the house, knew the routine, knew exactly how much noise could be made without waking the neighbors. In the first hours, hope was still alive, hope that the answers were right there, obvious, waiting to be picked up like fingerprints on a doorknob. But as dawn crept in and the light made everything look smaller and less cinematic, that hope began to thin. Friends described the victim as predictable, kind, anchored to family, someone whose life did not include enemies or secrets dramatic enough to explain the violence now attached to her name. Reporters arrived before breakfast, cameras trained on the front door, microphones poised to capture grief in real time, and the headline writers were already sharpening their verbs. Inside the family, shock settled into something heavier, a silence punctuated by questions no one wanted to ask out loud. The investigation surged forward in those early days, fueled by urgency and public attention, detectives knocking on doors, tracing last sightings, reconstructing timelines down to the minute, but every lead seemed to collapse under its own weight. A strange call reported by a neighbor turned out to be unrelated. A shadow seen near the house dissolved into nothing more than a late-night dog walker. A potential suspect with a history of violence had an alibi that checked out too cleanly to ignore. Days turned into weeks, and the language shifted, urgency replaced by caution, then by something more ominous: uncertainty. Evidence was boxed, labeled, stored, each item a promise that science or time might one day unlock what human intuition could not. The family learned the rhythms of police updates, the careful phrasing, the subtle signals that progress was slowing, and with each passing month, the house on that quiet street became a symbol, a place people drove past more slowly, a reminder that safety was not guaranteed by familiarity. By the end of the year, the case had cooled, not officially, not on paper, but in the way resources were quietly redirected and calls returned less quickly. The term cold case began to appear, first in internal memos, then in headlines that tried to revive interest with anniversaries and speculative angles. 10 years passed, then 20, and Sydney changed, skylines rising, streets renamed, but the file marked 1992 never quite went away. New detectives inherited it like a curse and a challenge, flipping through yellowed pages, listening to old tapes where voices spoke with confidence about leads that now sounded naive. Advances in forensic science breathed brief life into the case, a retest here, a comparison there, sparks of excitement that fizzled when results came back inconclusive. The family aged alongside the investigation, grief reshaping itself over time into something quieter but no less heavy, birthdays marked by absence, holidays shadowed by the unspoken question of whether this would be the year answers finally came. Rumors circulated, as they always do when silence stretches too long. Theories traded in pubs and online forums, some pointing outward to strangers, others circling uncomfortably close to home. Police denied nothing and confirmed little, a strategy that kept options open but also allowed suspicion to ferment. Then, decades later, a development broke the surface, sudden and shocking enough to snap the community awake from its long, uneasy sleep. A family member was named, charged. The words "cold case closed" splashed across screens and front pages with a finality that felt almost aggressive after so many years of doubt. Cameras returned to the street, now older, narrower, lined with trees that had grown tall while the truth stayed buried. Reactions were immediate and divided: relief, disbelief, anger, the sense that closure had arrived wearing the wrong face. Questions erupted faster than answers could be offered. Why now? Why this person? What had changed after 30 years of silence? Officials spoke of new evidence, of patterns re-examined, of pieces finally aligning, but specifics were scarce, protected by the slow grind of legal process. In the spaces between official statements, uncertainty rushed back in, louder than before. Those who remembered the early days replayed them in their minds, wondering what they had missed, what assumptions had guided the investigation down certain paths and away from others. The charged family member maintained innocence, supporters pointing to the absence of a confession, the lack of a clear narrative that made emotional sense. Critics argued that time had blurred memories beyond reliability, That pressure for resolution had finally outweighed the demand for certainty. And so the case entered a new phase, not quite resolved, not quite open, suspended in a strange limbo where a headline promised an ending but the details refused to cooperate. For the community, the shock was not just in the accusation itself, but in the realization that the past was not done with them, that a crime thought frozen in time could still reach forward and rearrange lives. At night, the street looked much as it always had, quiet, unremarkable, but those who knew its history felt the difference, a low hum of unresolved tension beneath the normal sounds of traffic and wind. Somewhere in an evidence room, boxes labeled 1992 waited once again to be opened, their contents poised between truth and interpretation. Somewhere else, a family sat divided by belief and doubt, each member holding on to a version of events that felt survivable. And hanging over it all was the uncomfortable possibility that even after 30 years, even with charges laid and headlines declared, the real story of that winter night in Sydney might still be slipping through the cracks, leaving behind only echoes, questions, and the cold, persistent sense that some cases never truly close. By the time the charge was announced, the city had already made up its mind about what closure was supposed to feel like, and when that feeling failed to arrive, something darker took its place, a restless need to understand how a story that had slept for 3 decades could wake up pointing inward, toward bloodlines and shared history. In 1992, the investigation files were thick with routine, timetables scribbled in pen, phone records printed on fading paper, statements taken in living rooms where family photos watched from the walls. Back then, detectives had focused outward, chasing the idea of an intruder, a prowler, a random act that could be contained and explained. The absence of forced entry was inconvenient but not fatal to that theory. Doors could be left unlocked, trust could be exploited by strangers just as easily as by loved ones. Early interviews with family members were brief, respectful, almost perfunctory, conducted under the assumption that grief itself was alibi enough. No one lingered too long on inconsistencies because no one wanted to imagine what it would mean if they mattered. As weeks passed without an arrest, the tone shifted, questions grew sharper, timelines were revisited, and the same answers were given again with slight variations that only seemed important years later. A family dinner mentioned in one statement happened on a Tuesday, then a Wednesday. A phone call remembered as late evening became early morning. Small fractures in memory, easily explained by trauma, easily ignored when investigators were still convinced the truth lived somewhere else. The neighborhood had its own theories, whispered between fences and over coffee, a mix of fear and fascination that fed on the lack of official answers. Some pointed to a transient scene nearby, others to a disgruntled acquaintance, but the most uncomfortable suspicions stayed unspoken, hovering like smoke that no one wanted to acknowledge. When the case cooled, it did so unevenly, activity dropping off in bursts rather than a clean stop, as if the investigation itself refused to admit defeat. Files were revisited on anniversaries, cold case units cycled through the material, each new team convinced they would be the ones to spot what everyone else had missed. Advances in forensic technology promised miracles, and for a moment, hope flared again. Biological samples were retested, fibers re-examined, partial profiles compared against expanding databases, but the results never crossed the threshold from interesting to decisive. Each near miss reinforced the sense that the truth was just out of reach, close enough to tease but too slippery to hold. Meanwhile, the family learned to live in parallel realities, one where life moved forward, careers advanced, children grew up, and another where 1992 remained frozen, replayed endlessly in private moments of doubt. Publicly, they presented a united front, careful with words, protective of one another, but privately, the strain showed. Old arguments resurfaced, new resentments formed, and the unasked question, could it have been someone among them, hung in the air like a taboo that grew heavier with every year of silence. When investigators returned decades later with renewed interest, the approach was different, less deferential, more analytical, shaped by experience, and perhaps by a quiet frustration with the past. Interviews were longer, more detailed, designed to trap inconsistencies rather than smooth them over. Memories were challenged, timelines tested against objective data, emotions observed as closely as facts. It was during this phase that attention began to narrow, focus shifting from the unknown outsider to the known circle, from what could have happened to who had the opportunity. Phone records were reconstructed, movements mapped, alibis scrutinized with a skepticism that had been absent in the early days. What emerged was not a smoking gun but a pattern, subtle and unsettling, suggesting that proximity, not randomness, might be the key. The idea that a family member could be responsible was not new, but now it had structure, a framework investigators could point to, even if the pieces still refused to lock together cleanly. When the charge finally came, it landed not as a solution but as an escalation, transforming a mystery into a battleground of narratives. Prosecutors spoke of cumulative evidence, of probability and behavior, of conclusions drawn not from a single dramatic revelation but from years of reanalysis. Defense voices countered with warnings about confirmation bias, about the danger of forcing meaning onto fragments simply because time had run out. The accused family member's life was dissected in public, past mistakes magnified, normal conflicts recast as potential motives, while supporters insisted that grief had been mistaken for guilt. The community watched, divided, some eager to accept the charge as long-delayed justice, others uneasy with the idea that certainty had been manufactured out of persistence rather than proof. Old neighbors were interviewed again, their memories now layered with decades of retelling, each version slightly altered by what they had read, heard, or imagined. The street itself became a character in the story, its quiet normalcy contrasted against the violence that once broke it, a reminder that crimes do not require dark alleys or anonymous crowds, only opportunity and silence. As legal proceedings loomed, details remained scarce, bound by restrictions that only fueled speculation. Online forums lit up with amateur analyses, timelines reconstructed by strangers who felt invested in solving what the authorities had not conclusively explained. Every newly surfaced detail was treated as either vindication or proof of a rush to judgment, depending on who was reading. For the family at the center, the fracture widened, belief and doubt pulling them in opposite directions, each stance a coping mechanism as much as a conclusion. The notion of closure, once so simple in theory, now felt almost obscene, a word that ignored the complexity of what had been unleashed. At night, those closest to the case found sleep difficult, thoughts looping back to 1992, to moments that now seemed loaded with meaning, to choices that felt newly suspect. The city, too, seemed restless, its fascination with the case a mix of empathy and voyeurism, driven by the unsettling idea that the answers might have been there all along, hidden in plain sight. And beneath every debate, every argument about evidence and intent, ran a deeper current of unease, the recognition that if this case could turn inward after 30 years, then no unresolved story was truly dormant, no past truly settled. As the legal process ground forward, slow and deliberate, the promise of resolution hovered just out of reach, and the case, once again, occupied that familiar space between certainty and doubt, where headlines speak louder than facts and the truth, whatever it is, waits patiently, unchanged by time, for someone to finally see it clearly. Time has a way of sanding down certainty, and by the third decade after the night in 1992, even the facts everyone thought they agreed on had begun to blur at the edges, softened by repetition and the quiet rewriting that happens when memory is asked to perform for too long. Investigators knew this, which is why the renewed push into the case did not start with dramatic revelations, but with something far less cinematic: spreadsheets, timelines rebuilt minute by minute, ordinary details dragged back into the light and forced to stand still. The night itself was reconstructed again, not as it had been told in the early 90s, but as it might have actually unfolded, stripped of assumptions and guided by what could be proven rather than what felt right. Who was awake? Who was asleep? Which lights were on? Which rooms were occupied? How long it would have taken to move through the house without making noise. Familiar ground, revisited with unfamiliar intent. The house, long since altered by renovations and new owners, was studied through photographs and diagrams, each doorway and hallway treated as a decision point. The absence of forced entry, once a footnote, now loomed larger, its implications harder to ignore. Someone had entered without resistance, or had never really entered at all. That realization narrowed the field in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. Old witness statements were replayed, voices crackling through outdated recording equipment, the confidence of youth preserved in analog tape. At the time, those voices sounded sincere, steady, but now investigators listened for hesitation, for the micropauses that suggested calculation rather than confusion. One statement, in particular, began to stand out not because it was overtly suspicious, but because it fit too neatly, its edges too smooth, its details aligning just a little too perfectly with what was already known. It was a statement given by a family member in the days after the crime, concise, cooperative, eager to help, and for years it had been treated as a model of transparency. Now, under renewed scrutiny, it felt rehearsed, as if the story had been practiced before it was ever told. That alone was not enough to mean anything, but it was enough to justify a closer look. Investigators began comparing early statements with later interviews, tracking how details shifted over time, how some memories sharpened while others conveniently faded. The changes were subtle, deniable, but they formed a pattern that could not be unseen once it was recognized. The family member's timeline, once accepted without question, now appeared flexible, capable of stretching to accommodate new information. Phone records, long thought lost, were partially recovered, their data incomplete but suggestive. Calls made and not returned, gaps that could be explained innocently or not. Technology had advanced, but it could only do so much with fragments. The case still relied heavily on human interpretation, and that was where the danger lay. The more investigators focused on the family, the more the narrative began to bend inward, reshaping past events to fit a present theory. Supporters of the accused warned that this was how miscarriages of justice were born, not from malice, but from the slow accumulation of assumptions treated as facts. Detectives countered that ignoring the obvious simply because it was uncomfortable was how killers escaped accountability. The tension between those positions ran through every decision, every press briefing, every leaked detail. Outside the investigation rooms, the story took on a life of its own. Media coverage intensified, no longer content with anniversary pieces and speculative retrospectives. Now there was a face, a name, a family connection that made the case feel intimate, almost invasive. Headlines spoke of betrayal, of secrets hidden behind closed doors, language designed to provoke emotion rather than understanding. Talkback radio buzzed with opinions, callers dividing themselves into camps based on instinct rather than evidence. Some insisted the charge proved what they had always suspected. Others recoiled at the idea that blood ties could be so easily reinterpreted as motive. The victim, once the center of the story, began to fade into the background, overshadowed by debates about process and probability. This shift disturbed those who remembered her as more than a symbol, who worried that the pursuit of resolution was erasing the very person it was supposed to honor. Inside the legal machinery, preparation continued, slow and meticulous. Prosecutors built their case not around a single piece of incontrovertible evidence, but around convergence, the idea that enough small indicators, when viewed together, could form a compelling picture. Opportunity, proximity, behavioral analysis, post-crime actions that now seemed odd when stripped of their original context. The defense prepared its counterargument with equal intensity, ready to dismantle each point by isolating it, reminding the court that probability was not proof and that time was an unreliable witness. They emphasized the lack of physical evidence tying the accused directly to the act, the dangers of retrofitting meaning onto decades-old behavior, the emotional toll of being cast as a villain in a story hungry for an ending. The accused themselves remained largely silent, advised by counsel, their public image shaped by others' words. In rare glimpses captured by cameras, their expression was unreadable, interpreted differently by everyone who looked. Some saw guilt, others shock, others the blank exhaustion of someone caught in a narrative they no longer controlled. For the extended family, gatherings became minefields, every conversation tinged with the unspoken awareness that loyalty and truth might now be incompatible. Long-buried grievances surfaced, childhood memories re-examined for signs that had supposedly been missed. The past was no longer a shared history, but a contested terrain. As the case moved closer to court, questions about the original investigation grew louder. Why certain leads were not pursued, why others were abandoned, whether early assumptions had steered detectives away from uncomfortable possibilities. Retired officers defended their work, citing the limitations of the time, the pressures of public expectation, the absence of tools now taken for granted. Critics argued that deference to family had been a mistake, that politeness had been allowed to override skepticism. The truth likely lived somewhere between those positions, shaped by human nature as much as by policy. The renewed scrutiny did not just target individuals, it challenged institutions, asking whether justice delayed could ever truly be justice delivered. In quiet moments, investigators themselves wrestled with doubt. They reviewed the file late at night, alone with the weight of a decision that would ripple through multiple lives. Was the case strong enough, or had the need to resolve a lingering wound begun to masquerade as certainty? Each piece of evidence was revisited, its significance questioned, its weaknesses acknowledged, and then reluctantly set aside. There was no moment of absolute clarity, no cinematic breakthrough, only a gradual narrowing of options until one path seemed more plausible than the rest. Whether plausibility was enough remained the central, unanswerable question. For the community, the case became a mirror reflecting deeper anxieties about trust and familiarity. If the danger had been close, if it had worn a familiar face, then the comfort derived from knowing one's neighbors, one's family, felt suddenly fragile. People locked doors more carefully, questioned routines they had once taken for granted. The street where it all began was mentioned again and again, its ordinariness emphasized as if repetition might make sense of the violence attached to it. Even those who had moved away found themselves drawn back into the story, compelled by the unresolved tension that refused to fade. As court dates were set and postponed, anticipation built, fueled by the promise that, finally, the details would be laid bare. Yet those closest to the case understood that whatever happened next, whatever verdict might eventually be delivered, the story would not end cleanly. Too much time had passed, too many narratives had formed and hardened. The case had already outgrown the event that created it, becoming something larger, heavier, a symbol of how mysteries evolve when left to age in public view. And so, as the legal process crept forward, the city waited, caught between the hope for answers and the fear that answers, when they came, might only deepen the sense of loss. The night in 1992 remained fixed, unchanging, while everything built on top of it continued to shift, reminding anyone who followed the story that resolution is not the same as truth, and that some questions, once asked, refuse to be satisfied by anything less than certainty. As the case edged closer to the courtroom, the past began to behave like a living thing, restless, resistant, pushing back against every attempt to pin it down. Evidence that had once seemed inert now carried new weight, not because it had changed, but because the story around it had. Investigators revisited the physical traces left behind in 1992, items cataloged and preserved with the care of another era, when expectations of what science could deliver were modest and patience was measured in months, not decades. Each object was re-examined under harsher light, its relevance debated, its limitations exposed. A fiber once dismissed as environmental noise was now scrutinized for origin and transfer. A mark on a surface, too ambiguous to matter back then, was photographed again, enhanced digitally, and argued over by experts who disagreed not on what it was, but on what it might mean. The absence of definitive forensic links remained the case's greatest vulnerability, a gap that no amount of reinterpretation could fully bridge. And yet, the prosecution pressed forward, leaning into narrative, into context, into the idea that truth could emerge from accumulation rather than revelation. Central to that narrative was behavior, the subtle choreography of actions before and after the night in question. Investigators mapped routines, habits, deviations so small they would have gone unnoticed without the benefit of hindsight. Why a light was left on. Why a call was made and then erased from memory. Why certain questions were asked in the days after and others were conspicuously avoided. None of it was illegal. None of it on its own was incriminating. But together, prosecutors argued, it painted a picture of someone navigating a crisis with foreknowledge rather than shock. The defense pushed back hard, calling this interpretation speculative, a psychological Rorschach test onto which suspicion had been projected. They reminded anyone who would listen that grief does not follow a script, that people behave strangely under trauma, that normal reactions can look sinister when filtered through decades of doubt. The clash between these perspectives played out not just in legal filings, but in the court of public opinion, where nuance struggled to survive. Media coverage intensified as procedural milestones approached, each hearing treated as a referendum on the past. Journalists dissected old interviews frame by frame, analyzing tone and posture as if guilt might be visible in a raised eyebrow or a delayed response. Former friends and acquaintances surfaced with anecdotes that now felt charged, stories once considered mundane recast as ominous foreshadowing. Some were sincere attempts to help, others thinly veiled bids for relevance in a story that had captured the city's attention. The line between information and entertainment blurred, and with it, the possibility of an impartial audience. The accused became a character in a narrative shaped by headlines, their humanity flattened by repetition. Every appearance was scrutinized, every silence interpreted, every word weighed for hidden meaning. In this environment, the idea of a fair reckoning felt increasingly fragile. Behind the scenes, legal teams prepared for a battle that would hinge as much on persuasion as on proof. Prosecutors refined their theory, anticipating points of attack, rehearsing explanations for gaps they could not fill. They leaned heavily on expert testimony, behavioral analysts and forensic specialists ready to speak in cautious terms about likelihoods and consistencies. The defense assembled its own experts, equally qualified, equally confident, prepared to dismantle those same conclusions with the precision of scalpel work. Juries, they knew, are not moved by technicalities alone. They respond to stories that make sense of chaos. The challenge lay in telling a story compelling enough to overcome the absence of a definitive moment, a single piece of evidence that could silence doubt. Without it, the case risked becoming a referendum on trust. Trust in institutions, trust in process, trust in the idea that persistence eventually leads to truth. The family at the center of it all lived under a microscope, their private fractures exposed to public view. Statements released through lawyers were parsed for subtext, expressions of support or distance magnified into symbols of allegiance. Some members withdrew entirely, retreating from the noise to preserve what little normalcy they could. Others felt compelled to speak, to defend, to accuse, each word deepening rifts that might never heal. The shared grief that once bound them now functioned as a fault line, splitting memories into competing versions of the same past. Holidays were no longer simply dates on a calendar. They were reminders of before and after, of a moment when everything diverged. The strain was visible, not just emotionally, but physically, etched into faces that had aged under the weight of unresolved history. As questions about the original investigation resurfaced, institutional introspection followed. Internal reviews acknowledged missed opportunities without conceding fatal error. Procedures were defended, then qualified, then contextualized within the norms of the early 90s. The critics argued that the reluctance to suspect family early on had been a blind spot, a cultural bias rooted in assumptions about domestic safety. Supporters countered that without evidence, suspicion would have been reckless, a violation of the very principles investigators are sworn to uphold. The debate had no clear resolution, only the uncomfortable recognition that hindsight is both powerful and unfair. Decisions made under pressure, with limited information, now appeared either prudent or negligent depending on who was looking and why. Meanwhile, the community grappled with its own role in sustaining the mystery. For years, the case had lingered on the edges of collective consciousness, resurfacing periodically as a cautionary tale or a source of macabre curiosity. Now it demanded engagement, forced residents to confront the possibility that justice might be messy, incomplete, or even wrong. Public forums filled with arguments that mirrored the courtroom strategies: probability versus proof, intuition versus restraint. The language of certainty crept in where it did not belong, declarations of guilt or innocence made with confidence that far outpaced the available facts. In this atmosphere, doubt itself became suspect, interpreted as weakness or complicity rather than intellectual honesty. As the first substantive court proceedings unfolded, the gravity of the situation settled in. This was no longer an abstract debate about a distant past. It was an active process with real consequences. The accused sat through hearings that revisited the worst night of their family's life. Every detail aired again, every assumption challenged. Observers noted the stillness, the careful control, the way emotion was managed behind a neutral exterior. Was it discipline or detachment? The question echoed through commentary, a reminder of how easily perception substitutes for knowledge. The victim's name was spoken repeatedly, attached to descriptions of violence that felt clinical, almost sanitized by legal necessity. For those who loved her, each recitation was a reopening of wounds that had never fully closed. Despite the momentum, uncertainty clung stubbornly to the case. No matter how thoroughly the arguments were constructed, how confidently they were presented, the core problem remained. Time had taken its toll. Memories were unreliable. Evidence was incomplete. Context had shifted. The past resisted simplification. Even those convinced of the prosecution's theory acknowledged, privately if not publicly, that the case rested on interpretation as much as fact. And interpretation, by its nature, is vulnerable to doubt. As one observer noted quietly, the danger was not that the court would fail to deliver a verdict, but that whatever verdict emerged would be asked to carry more weight than it could bear. Outside the courthouse, life went on, but with an undercurrent of tension that was hard to ignore. Conversations lowered when the case was mentioned, opinions hedged with qualifiers. The street where it all began remained unchanged in structure but altered in meaning, a place forever linked to questions that refused to settle. New residents learned its history in fragments, through gossip or late-night searches, inheriting a legacy they had not chosen. For them, the case was already history. For others, it was an open wound. As the proceedings advanced, the city braced itself, aware that no outcome would satisfy everyone, that the promise of closure was fragile and easily broken. In the end, what dominated the atmosphere was not anticipation, but unease. The sense that something fundamental was at stake, beyond the fate of any one person. This case had become a test of faith in the idea that truth can survive time, that justice can be delayed without being distorted. Whether that faith was warranted remained to be seen. For now, the story continued to unfold, layer by layer, each revelation raising as many questions as it answered, each step forward shadowed by the possibility that the real truth, whatever it was, might remain just beyond reach. Waiting in the silence between what could be proven and what could only be believed. The longer the proceedings stretched on, the clearer it became that this case was no longer just about what happened in a quiet Sydney house in 1992, but about how stories harden over time, how repetition turns speculation into something that feels like fact. In court, the past was unpacked day by day, each detail lifted out of context and examined under rules that demanded precision where memory offered only approximation. Witnesses returned to the stand older, slower, their voices carrying the strain of being asked to remember moments that had long since fused with everything that followed. They spoke carefully, hedging statements with qualifiers, aware that certainty could be used against them. Prosecutors guided them through timelines that felt both familiar and foreign, dates and times reconstructed with a confidence that belied the fragility of the underlying material. The defense listened closely, ready to expose every inconsistency, every hesitation, every place where recollection drifted into assumption. What emerged was not a clean narrative, but a mosaic of overlapping perspectives, none of them complete. Central to the prosecution's case was the idea of access and opportunity, the argument that the crime could not have occurred without intimate knowledge of the house and its rhythms. Diagrams were displayed, routes traced, distances measured, all designed to show how easily someone familiar could move through the space unnoticed. The defense countered with the obvious but uncomfortable truth that familiarity was not exclusive to family, that trust extends beyond blood, that assumptions about who belongs can blind as much as they clarify. Each side presented experts who spoke with authority and restraint, their disagreements framed in technical language that masked the stakes beneath. To the untrained ear, it was a battle of probabilities, but beneath that lay something more elemental, whose interpretation of human behavior would be believed. The accused remained largely silent, a presence more felt than heard, their posture and expressions dissected by observers searching for meaning. Every glance, every shift in the chair, was noted, photographed, interpreted, as if the body might betray what words did not. Supporters saw composure under pressure, a person wrongfully accused holding themselves together. Critics saw calculation, a practiced calm that felt rehearsed. The truth, whatever it was, remained inaccessible, trapped behind legal strategy and personal survival. When the accused finally did speak, briefly, in response to a procedural matter, the room leaned in, hungry for revelation. None came. The voice was steady, the words minimal, offering nothing that could satisfy the appetite for clarity. Outside the courtroom, the city followed along in fragments, updates consumed between commutes and meals, the complexity of the case flattened into headlines and sound bites. Social media amplified the loudest voices, certainty rewarded with attention, doubt dismissed as weakness. Amateur sleuths published elaborate theories, complete with timelines and motive charts, some eerily persuasive, others wildly speculative. Each new post added another layer of narrative sediment, burying the original event deeper beneath interpretation. For those closest to the case, this noise was exhausting, a constant reminder that their private tragedy had become public property, open to analysis by strangers with no stake in the outcome beyond entertainment or outrage. As testimony continued, attention turned to what had not been done in 1992, the roads not taken, the questions not asked. Former investigators were called to explain their decisions, to justify why certain lines of inquiry had been deprioritized or abandoned. They spoke of limited resources, of competing cases, of judgments made with the information available at the time. The defense seized on these admissions, framing them as evidence of an investigation shaped by assumption rather than rigor. The prosecution pushed back, arguing that no investigation is perfect, that hindsight distorts responsibility, that mistakes do not negate truth. The exchange highlighted a deeper tension, whether the present could fairly judge the past without rewriting it. One particularly contentious moment centered on a piece of evidence that had long sat in the file, without resolution. Its significance had shifted over the years, elevated and diminished, depending on who was speaking. In court, it was presented with careful caveats, its limitations acknowledged even as its implications were emphasized. The defense dismantled it point by point, demonstrating how easily meaning could be inferred rather than proven. Watching this exchange, it became clear how much of the case depended on interpretation layered atop interpretation, each step moving further from the raw event. The jury, tasked with navigating this complexity, sat silently, their expressions guarded, absorbing a story that resisted simplification. The victim's presence in the courtroom was paradoxical, both central and absent. Her name was invoked repeatedly, attached to descriptions of injuries and timelines, but the person she had been remained elusive, flattened into a role defined by what had been done to her. Friends who testified struggled to balance grief with objectivity, their words trembling as they tried to convey who she was without drifting into advocacy. The defense treated them gently, aware that aggression would backfire, while the prosecution leaned on their accounts to humanize the stakes. For a moment, the legal machinery slowed, allowing a glimpse of the loss that had set everything in motion. Then the process resumed, indifferent to sentiment. As weeks passed, fatigue set in. Observers noticed it first in the minor details: shorter tempers, heavier sighs, a collective impatience for resolution. The court schedule dragged, adjournments piling up, each delay feeding speculation about strategy and confidence. Was one side stalling? Was the other regrouping? Every pause was interpreted as a signal. Behind the scenes, legal teams adjusted tactics, responding to the evolving shape of the case. What had seemed strong on paper felt weaker in the open air of cross-examination. What had appeared inconsequential began to loom larger under sustained attention. The story was changing in real time, reshaped by the very act of being told. For the family, the strain was relentless. Sitting through testimony meant hearing intimate details discussed as abstractions, personal history transformed into evidence. Some members attended every day, determined to bear witness. Others could not bring themselves to enter the room, choosing distance over exposure. Relationships shifted subtly, alliances forming and dissolving based on how each person interpreted what they heard. Silence became a strategy, conversation a risk. The idea of unity, once a source of strength, now felt like an impossible standard. As the prosecution neared the end of its case, anticipation mixed with apprehension. Had enough been established to justify the charge? Or had the narrative relied too heavily on inference, asking the jury to bridge gaps with intuition rather than evidence? Legal analysts debated these questions publicly, their opinions shaping expectations. Some predicted conviction, citing the cumulative weight of the story. Others warned of acquittal, pointing to the absence of a definitive link. The uncertainty underscored a fundamental truth. This was not a case that would resolve itself cleanly, regardless of outcome. When the defense began presenting its case, the tone shifted. Where the prosecution had emphasized convergence, the defense focused on fragmentation, breaking the narrative into pieces and questioning each one's integrity. They highlighted alternative explanations not to prove them, but to demonstrate reasonable doubt. Each possibility reopened the space between suspicion and certainty, reminding the jury of the standard they were sworn to uphold. The strategy was methodical, almost surgical, stripping away layers of assumption to reveal the raw ambiguity beneath. By the end of the fifth phase of proceedings, the atmosphere was heavy with unresolved tension. The courtroom felt like a pressure chamber, every word adding to the weight. Outside, the city waited, oscillating between confidence and unease, invested in an ending that might never deliver the comfort it promised. The case, now fully alive again, had exposed fractures not just in a family or an investigation, but in the collective belief that time clarifies rather than complicates. As arguments continued, and the story edged closer to its most consequential moment, one thing was already clear. Whatever verdict lay ahead, it would not silence the questions that had been gathering since 1992. It would simply add another layer to a mystery that had learned how to survive. By the time the defense rested, the courtroom felt saturated, as if every surface had absorbed decades of grief, argument, and unresolved expectation. Closing arguments did not arrive like a thunderclap. They settled in slowly, methodical and deliberate, each side acutely aware that persuasion now mattered more than discovery. The prosecution spoke of coherence, of how individual uncertainties, when viewed together, formed a shape that could no longer be ignored. They returned again and again to proximity, to behavior that seemed less like coincidence and more like design, reminding the jury that crimes committed in familiar spaces rarely announce themselves with spectacle. The absence of chaos, they argued, was itself a clue. This was not a random eruption of violence, but something contained, controlled, carried out by someone who knew exactly where they were and how much time they had. The defense responded by dismantling that certainty, warning against the seduction of a story that felt complete simply because it had been told so many times. They spoke of time as a contaminant, of memory as an unreliable narrator, of the danger in mistaking narrative elegance for truth. Each gap, they insisted, mattered. Each assumption was a step away from the standard of proof. The jury listened, faces unreadable, notebooks filled with fragments that might later become decisive. They were reminded that sympathy, however natural, was not evidence, that the weight of a tragedy could not be allowed to tip the scales. As instructions were read, the language of law replaced the language of story, precise and unforgiving. Then deliberations began, and the courtroom emptied, leaving behind an echo of anticipation that felt almost physical. Outside, the city held its breath. Newsrooms prepared multiple headlines, analysts rehearsed their explanations, families waited in silence broken only by the hum of speculation. Hours passed, then days, each one fueling rumors about division, about stubborn holdouts, about votes shifting back and forth in a locked room where no one could see. When the verdict finally came, it did not land as resolution but as rupture. The words were spoken clearly, formally, stripped of drama, yet their impact rippled outward instantly. Reactions fractured along familiar lines, relief for some, disbelief for others, a shared sense that something irreversible had occurred. Supporters of the outcome spoke of accountability long delayed, of justice finally catching up with time. Critics recoiled, arguing that doubt had been overridden by exhaustion, that persistence had been mistaken for proof. The accused stood still, absorbing the moment with an expression that defied easy interpretation, while family members reacted in ways that cameras struggled to capture without intruding. Tears flowed, but not uniformly, and in that unevenness lay the truth of how divided the story had become. Sentencing loomed as another chapter rather than an endpoint, its own ritual of statements and summaries, of lives reduced to bullet points and timelines. The victim was remembered again, this time through the lens of consequence, her absence invoked as justification, as warning, as reason. Words like closure were used cautiously, if at all, their hollowness apparent even to those who believed the process had worked. When the formalities concluded and the courtroom cleared, the case did not dissolve into history as expected. Instead, it followed everyone out into the street, clinging to conversations, dominating headlines, refusing to settle. Almost immediately, appeals were discussed, legal avenues mapped out with the same precision that had defined the trial itself. Questions about the strength of the evidence resurfaced, now sharpened by the reality of a verdict. Experts debated whether the cumulative approach had crossed a line, whether the jury had been asked to do too much interpretive work. Supporters of the conviction countered that circumstantial cases are still cases, that certainty does not require spectacle. The tension between these positions became the new center of gravity, shifting the conversation from what happened in 1992 to what the justice system had done with that uncertainty 30 years later. For the family, the verdict did not simplify anything. It rearranged relationships rather than resolving them, forcing each member to decide what version of events they could live with. Some accepted the outcome as painful but necessary, a line drawn at last. Others withdrew further, convinced that an irreversible mistake had been made. Gatherings became rarer, conversations more guarded, the shared past now a minefield of interpretation. The accused, now convicted, entered a different kind of silence, one shaped by routine and restriction, their story continuing out of public view, but not out of public imagination. In the community, the case became a reference point, shorthand for the dangers of both delay and determination. It was cited in discussions about cold cases, about the ethics of reopening wounds, about the balance between hope and restraint. The street where it began saw another brief surge of attention before settling back into anonymity, its significance now carried more in memory than in fact. Yet even as daily life resumed, The unease remained, a sense that something essential had been decided without being fully understood. The verdict answered a legal question, but it did not still the deeper one that had haunted the case from the beginning, whether the truth had truly been found or merely selected.
Part 7.
In the months that followed, the case refused to fade, lingering in the cultural bloodstream like a low-grade fever. Appeals were filed, documents dense with legal language that translated doubt into formal argument. Each filing reopened the story, forcing a return to evidence that had already been examined to exhaustion. This time, the focus narrowed further, zeroing in on procedure, on whether the jury had been properly guided, on whether inference had been allowed to masquerade as certainty. The prosecution defended the process with confidence, insisting that the trial had unfolded exactly as the law intended. The defense framed the conviction as a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when the hunger for resolution outpaces the available facts. Once again, the case balanced on interpretation. Public interest spiked and ebbed with each development, attention flaring when a hearing was scheduled, dimming when delays stretched on. The rhythm was familiar now, a cycle of anticipation and disappointment that mirrored the case's entire history. For some, the appeals represented hope, a chance to correct what they saw as an injustice. For others, they felt like an affront, an unwillingness to accept accountability after so many years. The divide hardened, opinions calcifying into identities. To question the conviction was, for some, to disrespect the victim. To accept it without reservation was, for others, to endorse a dangerous precedent. The space for uncertainty grew smaller with each passing month. Media narratives adapted accordingly, shifting tone from investigation to aftermath. Profiles examined the toll on everyone involved, tracing how decades of suspicion and scrutiny had reshaped lives. The victim was remembered in softer terms now, stories emphasizing her ordinariness, her place in a community that had carried her absence like a scar. The accused was portrayed through competing lenses, either as a figure finally unmasked or as a person consumed by a system unwilling to admit doubt. These portrayals said as much about the audience as about the individuals themselves, reflecting a collective need to believe that the ending made sense. Behind the scenes, cold case units across the country watched closely, aware that this case would influence how others were pursued. Training sessions referenced it obliquely, discussions framed around lessons learned rather than conclusions drawn. How much inference is too much? How long is too long? When does reopening become reinterpreting? The answers were not clear, but the questions mattered. This case had become a benchmark, cited not for its clarity, but for its complexity, a reminder that time does not simplify crime, it compounds it. For those who had lived with the case from the beginning, the aftermath was quieter but no less heavy. The rituals of grief that had once centered on anniversaries now had to accommodate a new reality, one shaped by a verdict that felt both definitive and incomplete. Some found comfort in the idea that the system had spoken, that uncertainty had been narrowed even if not eliminated. Others felt a renewed sense of loss, convinced that the wrong story had been elevated, that the real truth had slipped away during the long wait. Conversations turned inward, doubts shared only with those deemed safe. As appeal hearings unfolded, judges listened to arguments that revisited familiar ground with surgical precision. Technicalities were dissected, language parsed, precedents invoked. The emotional weight that had dominated the trial was replaced by abstraction, the human story compressed into questions about admissibility and instruction. Decisions were reserved, timelines extended, the process stretching on with the same stubborn endurance that had defined the case for 30 years. Each delay reinforced the sense that there would be no clean end, only stages of exhaustion. Outside the legal sphere, the case took on a second life as cautionary myth. It was discussed in classrooms, debated in podcasts, analyzed in long-form essays that treated it as both narrative and warning. The phrase Sydney 1992 became shorthand for unresolved tension, for the uneasy marriage of memory and law. People who had not been born when the crime occurred now spoke about it with familiarity, inheriting a story already shaped by decades of interpretation. The original event receded further, obscured by layers of meaning that had little to do with that winter night. And still, beneath everything, the core question persisted, untouched by verdicts or appeals. What actually happened in that house, in those quiet hours when the city slept? The legal system had offered its answer, carefully reasoned and formally delivered, but belief remained fragmented. For some, the case was closed. For others, it was merely contained, its uncertainty boxed and labeled, but not resolved. The difference mattered because it defined how people understood justice itself, as a mechanism for certainty or a framework for decision-making in the absence of it. Years from now, the files will still exist, their contents unchanged, waiting for future eyes to read them with fresh assumptions. Technology will advance, standards will evolve, and the case may be revisited yet again, not because new evidence has emerged, but because context has shifted. That possibility hangs over the story like an unanswered call, a reminder that finality is often an illusion. The community will move on, as communities do, carrying the case as part of its history rather than its present. But for those who know it intimately, who have traced its contours through decades of silence and noise, the case will remain active in a deeper sense. In the end, what lingers is not the verdict or the arguments that surrounded it, but the unease that first settled in 1992 and never fully lifted. The knowledge that some stories resist resolution, that answers can be reached without certainty, that justice can be both done and doubted at the same time. The Sydney cold case, declared closed by headlines and courts, continues to echo in that uneasy space, reminder that the past is never as finished as we want it to be, and that some questions once asked do not disappear. They simply wait, patient and unresolved, for the next moment when someone decides to listen again. Long after the appeals entered their slow orbit through the courts, the case settled into a quieter phase, not resolved but sedimented, layered into the city's consciousness the way unresolved things often are. The noise faded first. Cameras stopped waiting outside buildings. Commentators moved on to fresher scandals. But beneath that surface calm, the story continued to work on people, reshaping how they remembered not just the crime, but the years that followed it. For some, the verdict hardened into truth through repetition alone, a conclusion accepted because it had survived challenge. For others, doubt sharpened with distance, freed from the emotional immediacy of trial theatrics and press conferences. The same facts were still there, unchanged, but the way they were held began to diverge even more dramatically. In private, jurors replayed their deliberations, moments of agreement and hesitation revisited in the quiet hours when obligation had ended but responsibility had not. Some felt reassured by the process, convinced they had done what the law required of them. Others wondered whether they had mistaken coherence for certainty, whether the pressure to decide had pushed them toward a story that felt complete rather than one that was demonstrably true. None of these doubts appeared in official records. They lived instead in the margins of memory, unspoken, carried alone. This was the hidden aftermath of a long-delayed verdict, the realization that deciding does not always settle believing. The accused world narrowed dramatically, reduced to routines governed by rules and schedules, a life measured in counts and clearances. Public attention waned, but the identity imposed by the case did not. Inside, time moved differently, each day echoing the last, the future defined by paperwork and procedure rather than possibility. Letters arrived from strangers, some offering support, others condemnation, each one a reminder that the story was still being told elsewhere. Legal options were discussed, revised, postponed, hope calibrated carefully to avoid collapse. Innocence, guilt, regret, defiance. Outside observers assigned these emotions freely, but the reality remained inaccessible, sealed behind walls and protocol. For the victims' loved ones, the aftermath unfolded in uneven ways. Some embraced the verdict as a form of stability, something solid to stand on after decades of drift. They spoke of relief not as joy, but as the absence of constant anticipation, the end of waiting for a phone call that might never come. Others felt unsettled, sensing that the story had been forced into an ending that did not quite fit. For them, the verdict brought a new kind of grief, layered atop the old, complicated by the fear that the truth had been obscured rather than revealed. Conversations about the case grew shorter, more guarded, as if too much discussion risked reopening fractures that had barely begun to close. The house where it all began had long since changed hands, its rooms repainted, its floors replaced, its history unadvertised. New occupants lived there unaware at first, then curious, then cautious, once the story surfaced in late-night searches and whispered warnings. They described a persistent sense of unease, not supernatural, but psychological, the feeling of occupying a space that had absorbed more than it revealed. Neighbors noticed nothing unusual, no disturbances, no echoes of violence, yet the address carried a weight that did not diminish with renovation. Places remembered differently than people do, holding on to meaning without explanation. In academic circles, the case began to appear in discussions about delayed justice and evidentiary thresholds. Law reviews dissected the trial strategy, the reliance on cumulative inference, the management of reasonable doubt over extreme spans of time. Psychologists weighed in on memory degradation, on how repeated retelling alters recollection until confidence becomes detached from accuracy. Sociologists pointed to the role of media in shaping expectations of resolution, the way cold cases are framed as puzzles that must have solutions rather than tragedies that sometimes do not. Each analysis added another interpretive layer, moving the case further from the raw event and deeper into abstraction. Cold case investigators watched closely, not for answers, but for caution. Training materials referenced the case without naming it, emphasizing the dangers of tunnel vision, the importance of documenting doubt as carefully as belief. Younger detectives listened with a mixture of respect and unease, aware that they might one day inherit files just as heavy, just as compromised by time. The lesson was not clear-cut. Persistence was praised, but so was restraint. The case resisted becoming a model, functioning instead as a warning about complexity, about how reopening the past can illuminate and distort in equal measure. Public memory of the crime evolved in subtle ways. Early retellings focused on shock and mystery, the violence erupting in an ordinary place. Later versions centered on betrayal and proximity, the idea that danger had been close all along. After the trial, the narrative shifted again toward process and consequence, a story about systems as much as individuals. Each version said less about 1992 and more about the moment in which it was told. The original event receded further, obscured by the needs of storytelling, by the human impulse to find meaning even when evidence resists it. Anniversaries came and went with less fanfare, marked quietly by those who remembered and unnoticed by those who did not. On some years, a brief article appeared, cautious in tone, acknowledging the passage of time without reopening debate. On others, silence prevailed. The absence of attention felt strange at first, then inevitable. Not all cases remain public property forever. Some simply age out of relevance, leaving behind a residue of unresolved feeling rather than active controversy. Yet for those closest to it, the case never fully receded. It lived on in habits of thought, in a reflexive skepticism toward simple answers. Occasionally, new rumors surfaced, fragments of information presented as revelations, but quickly collapsing under scrutiny. A supposed witness. A reinterpreted piece of evidence. A claim that technology might soon unlock what had remained closed. Each flare of speculation reignited old arguments, then faded when substance failed to materialize. The cycle was familiar, almost ritualistic, reinforcing the sense that the case had become self-sustaining, capable of generating intrigue even in the absence of genuine discovery. This, too, was a consequence of time, the transformation of uncertainty into a permanent feature rather than a temporary condition. In moments of reflection, some involved in the case admitted to a quiet ambivalence about the outcome. Not regret, exactly, but an awareness of limits. They spoke about the difference between legal truth and historical truth, between what can be proven and what may have happened. These distinctions mattered deeply in theory, less so in practice, where decisions had to be made. The law demands endings. Human experience does not always provide them. The tension between those realities had been present from the beginning, growing more pronounced with every year that passed without answers. The city itself absorbed the story unevenly. For most, it became background noise, a reference point that occasionally resurfaced in conversation. For others, it altered their sense of safety, their understanding of familiarity and trust. Crimes that linger unresolved have a way of expanding beyond their immediate impact, shaping attitudes and assumptions long after the details are forgotten. The Sydney case did this quietly, without spectacle, embedding itself in the collective psyche as a reminder that proximity does not equal protection and that time does not guarantee clarity. As years continued to pass, the possibility of definitive resolution diminished further. Evidence aged. Witnesses passed away. Context shifted irreversibly. Whatever the truth of that night had been, it now existed only in fragments, distributed unevenly across memories, records, and interpretations. The case file remained intact, but its meaning grew increasingly dependent on who was reading it and why. Future reviews might reinterpret it yet again, not because new facts emerged, but because values and expectations had changed. What remained constant was the unease, the sense that something essential had been lost not just in the act itself, but in the long wait that followed. The delay had reshaped everything, turning a single violent moment into a decades-long negotiation with uncertainty. Whether justice had been served or merely performed was a question that refused to settle. It lingered in the background of every discussion, every analysis, every quiet doubt. And so the case persisted, not as an active investigation or a headline-grabbing scandal, but as an unresolved presence, a reminder that some stories do not conclude when the court adjourns or the appeals are filed. They continue in memory, in debate, in the uncomfortable space between belief and proof. The Sydney cold case, declared closed yet endlessly questioned, remained what it had always been at its core, a fracture in time, a moment that resisted containment, echoing forward not with answers, but with the enduring weight of what could not be fully known. As the years stacked quietly on top of one another, the case began to function less like a story with an ending and more like a lens through which everything else was judged. New crimes were reported, new investigations launched, but comparisons crept in uninvited. Commentators asked whether lessons had been learned, whether authorities would wait decades again, whether proximity would still be mistaken for safety. The Sydney case became shorthand, a reference point invoked to warn and to justify, its details blurred but its emotional charge intact. In this way, it continued to shape the present without ever fully returning to it. Within the justice system, the aftershocks were subtle but real. Prosecutors grew more cautious with cold cases, aware of the scrutiny that followed delayed charges. Defense attorneys cited the case when arguing against inference-heavy prosecutions, framing it as evidence of how time corrodes reliability. Judges, too, seemed to carry it in the back of their minds, their rulings laced with careful language about standards and safeguards. None of this was officially attributed to the case, but its influence was felt in the pauses, the hesitations, the extra pages of reasoning appended to decisions. It had become a quiet participant in conversations about fairness and finality. For those who had lived inside the story, the passage of time brought neither clarity nor peace, only distance. Distance from the intensity of trial days, from the constant surveillance of public attention, from the sense that every word mattered. But distance did not erase the questions. It only softened their edges, making them easier to live with but harder to resolve. People adapted in small ways, learning which conversations to avoid, which anniversaries to acknowledge privately, which memories to leave untouched. Survival became less about answers and more about containment. The convicted individual's appeals moved slowly, as appeals always do, navigating procedural corridors that felt endless by design. Each denial was written in careful language, acknowledging complexity while affirming outcome. Each affirmation reinforced the official version of events without necessarily strengthening belief. Supporters read these decisions with mounting frustration, convinced that process had replaced truth as the primary concern. Critics read them as confirmation that the system had worked, that scrutiny had been applied, and the result upheld. Both sides found validation, a testament to how elastic interpretation had become. Occasionally, a former juror would speak anonymously, offering glimpses into deliberations that had been sealed by duty. These accounts were fragmentary, cautious, shaped by time and self-protection. They spoke of long hours, of arguments circling the same points, of moments when consensus felt impossible and moments when it felt inevitable. None claimed certainty. Some described the decision as the least unsatisfactory option rather than a confident conclusion. These revelations did little to change minds, but added texture to a process often imagined as decisive. They underscored a truth rarely acknowledged, that verdicts are human products, forged under constraints, influenced by fatigue as much as by reason. The victim's story continued to evolve in parallel, shaped by those who remembered her and those who learned about her secondhand. Memorials were modest, personal, far from cameras. Stories shared focused on ordinary kindnesses, on routines that had once seemed insignificant and now felt precious. In these moments, the case receded, replaced by a quieter act of remembrance that resisted the language of guilt and innocence. For a brief time, the noise fell away and the loss stood on its own, unburdened by argument. These moments did not last, but they mattered. The neighborhood where it all began changed again, as neighborhoods do. Businesses turned over. Families moved in and out. The street lost its association with the case for those without memory of it, becoming just another address, another stretch of pavement. Yet for some, a certain tension lingered, an awareness that history could cling to places invisibly. They spoke of it rarely, sensing that repetition drained meaning rather than reinforcing it. The past did not haunt them so much as coexist, a parallel layer beneath the present. Academic interest in the case waned, replaced by newer examples, fresher controversies. Citations declined. Panels moved on. But in the footnotes of discussions about cold cases and delayed prosecutions, the Sydney case remained, a quiet citation that carried disproportionate weight. It represented not a solution but a dilemma, a reminder that reopening a case can illuminate and obscure at the same time. Scholars debated whether the case should be taught as success or warning, often concluding that it was both, depending on what one valued more, resolution or restraint. Technology advanced, as it always does, promising answers to questions once deemed unanswerable. New forensic methods were announced, each greeted with a familiar mix of hope and skepticism. Could this finally clarify what decades had blurred? Could a fragment yield certainty at last? But the reality was less dramatic. Evidence, when it exists, must still exist in usable form. In this case, time had taken too much. The promise of technology remained theoretical, its potential blunted by the simple fact that some moments leave no trace strong enough to survive 30 years of waiting. Rumors continued to surface, quieter now, confined to online corners and late-night conversations. A claim of a confession overheard. A suggestion that someone else had been involved. Each rumor followed the same arc: brief excitement, rapid scrutiny, inevitable collapse. These cycles no longer shocked anyone. They were treated as symptoms rather than revelations, signs of a story that refused to settle rather than evidence of new truth. The case had learned how to regenerate speculation, feeding on its own uncertainty. For the broader public, the emotional charge diminished with time. New crises demanded attention. The case became one story among many, its significance diluted by distance. Yet when it was mentioned, it still elicited a pause, a recognition that this was not a simple narrative. People remembered how long it had taken, how messy the outcome had been, how divided opinions remained. In this way, It continued to influence attitudes toward justice, injecting skepticism into discussions that once assumed clarity. Those closest to the case reached a kind of equilibrium, not peace but balance. They learned how to hold conflicting ideas at once, that something terrible had happened, that the response to it had been earnest, that certainty remained elusive. This balance was fragile, easily disrupted by anniversaries or headlines, but it allowed life to continue. It was not the closure once promised by headlines, but it was survivable. Perhaps that was the most anyone could hope for after so long. In private moments, doubts still surfaced, unbidden and unresolved. What if a detail had been misunderstood? What if a memory had been misfiled? What if the real explanation had been simpler or stranger than anyone imagined? These questions did not demand answers so much as acknowledgement. They existed alongside acceptance, not canceling it out but complicating it. The human mind, after all, is capable of holding contradiction when certainty proves unreachable. As the case moved further into the past, its meaning continued to shift. It was no longer just about a crime or a trial, but about endurance, about how societies deal with unresolved harm. It asked uncomfortable questions without offering guidance. How long should we pursue certainty? When does persistence become distortion? Is it better to decide imperfectly or to leave questions unanswered? The case did not answer these questions. It embodied them. And so it remained, a story neither alive nor dead, suspended between resolution and doubt. The Sydney cold case, once defined by silence and later by noise, settled into a quieter, more troubling state, acceptance without understanding. It existed as a reminder that time does not heal everything, that justice can be rendered without conviction of truth, that some nights remain opaque no matter how often they are revisited. In that opacity lay its lasting power, not as a solved mystery, but as a testament to the limits of knowing and to the uneasy compromises made when the need for an ending collides with the stubborn refusal of the past to provide one. By the 10th year after the verdict, the case had slipped into a strange afterlife, no longer urgent enough to dominate conversation, yet too unresolved to disappear entirely. It resurfaced in unexpected places, not as breaking news, but as reference, an example invoked when certainty was questioned or when the limits of justice were debated. Its name carried a quiet gravity, signaling complexity without requiring explanation. People remembered how it had unfolded, not in detail, but in feeling. The slow burn, the sudden charge, the uneasy ending. That feeling lingered, shaping reactions to other stories, other accusations, other promises of closure. Those who had worked the case professionally carried it differently. For some investigators, it became a point of pride, evidence that persistence could overcome time's resistance. They spoke of it as proof that no file is ever truly dormant, that answers can be found if one is willing to look long enough. Others were more guarded, acknowledging the effort while questioning the outcome. In private conversations, they admitted to moments of doubt, to wondering whether the case had been solved or simply concluded. These doubts were rarely voiced publicly. Institutions do not thrive on ambivalence. But among individuals they lingered, shaping how future cases were approached, how confidence was tempered with caution. The legal professionals involved moved on to other work, other trials, other arguments, yet the case followed them in subtle ways. A prosecutor hesitated before advancing a theory built primarily on inference. A defense lawyer pushed harder against assumptions rooted in familiarity rather than fact. Judges wrote opinions with extra care, aware of how language could harden uncertainty into precedent. None of this was dramatic. It manifested in tone, in phrasing, in the space allowed for doubt. The case had become part of the professional muscle memory of those who had touched it. For the convicted individual, time settled into monotony, broken only by routine reviews and the faint possibility of future reconsideration. Life became smaller, bounded by walls and schedules, the outside world reduced to fragments delivered through letters and filtered news. The case remained a constant presence, not as narrative but as condition, shaping every interaction, every plan. Hope was managed carefully, rationed to prevent collapse. There were days when belief in eventual vindication felt possible, and days when acceptance threatened to take its place. Neither state offered peace. They simply alternated, marking time. The victim's absence continued to ripple outward, its impact less visible but no less real. Younger relatives grew up with a story they inherited rather than experienced, their understanding shaped by what they were told and what they sensed was left unsaid. For them, the case was history, but a history that intruded on the present in subtle ways. Family gatherings carried an undercurrent of restraint, certain topics avoided, certain questions unanswered. The loss had become structural, embedded in the family's shape rather than its conversation. This was the long-term cost of unresolved violence, not constant pain, but permanent alteration. Public memory of the case grew thinner, its edges softened by distance. When it was mentioned, details were often wrong, timelines blurred, names misremembered. Accuracy mattered less than impression. The story had become symbolic, standing in for a category of events rather than a specific one. This dilution was not malicious, it was inevitable. Societies cannot hold every detail of every tragedy indefinitely. What they retain are lessons, warnings, myths. The Sydney case had become all three, depending on who was recalling it and why. In media retrospectives, the tone shifted again, less accusatory, more reflective. Long-form pieces examine the human cost of delay, the psychological toll of living in uncertainty for decades. These articles avoided definitive claims, focusing instead on process and impact. They asked readers to consider not just whether the verdict was right, but what it meant to pursue resolution after so much time had passed. Comment sections filled with familiar arguments, but also with quieter admissions of discomfort. The case no longer provoked outrage so much as unease, a recognition that some answers come at a price that is difficult to calculate. Cold case units continued their work, buoyed by successes and constrained by realities. The Sydney case was occasionally referenced in training, not as a blueprint, but as a boundary. It marked the edge of what persistence could achieve without new evidence. Detectives debated it among themselves, some admiring the determination, others wary of the outcome. These debates were not about blame, but about philosophy. What is the goal of reopening a case? To find truth, or to reach a decision? Ideally both. But the case suggested that sometimes those goals diverge. Technology continued its advance as promised, but with diminishing relevance to this particular story. New tools required fresh material, clearer traces, opportunities that had long since passed. The idea of a future breakthrough faded, replaced by acceptance that the evidentiary window had closed. What remained was interpretation, and interpretation does not age well. It shifts with perspective, with values, with cultural context. The same facts, viewed through different lenses, could support different conclusions. This realization unsettled those who wanted certainty to be durable. Occasionally, someone new would encounter the case for the first time, unburdened by years of debate. They would read the summaries, watch the documentaries, and ask the question that had never fully gone away: what actually happened? Their curiosity was earnest, their confusion understandable. Those who had lived with the case longest struggled to answer. They offered caveats, context, competing views. Rarely did they offer conviction. Experience had taught them caution. The longer one stayed with the story, the less confident one became. In the community where the crime had occurred, the case's presence was now mostly historical. Older residents remembered the shock, the fear, the long silence. Newer ones knew it only as a footnote, if at all. Life went on, shaped more by current concerns than by a decades-old mystery. Yet traces remained, in the way people talked about safety, in the stories told to children, in the quiet acknowledgement that familiarity does not guarantee security. These traces were not always conscious. They were absorbed, like background radiation, altering behavior without announcing themselves. The case also influenced how people understood the concept of closure. Once imagined as a definitive end, Closure now seemed more like a narrative device than a lived reality. Those who had been promised it learned that decisions do not erase doubt, that answers do not always soothe. Closure, it turned out, was less about certainty and more about endurance, about finding ways to live alongside unresolved questions without being consumed by them. This was not the ending anyone had hoped for, but it was the one that emerged. As the years passed, anniversaries became quieter still, marked privately or not at all. The case receded from public calendars, replaced by new stories demanding attention. This fading felt both like relief and like loss. Relief, because constant scrutiny had been exhausting. Loss, because attention had at least kept the questions alive. In obscurity, the case risked becoming fixed, its ambiguities frozen rather than examined. Yet perhaps that was inevitable. Not every story can remain open indefinitely. In moments of solitude, those most affected by the case returned to the same thoughts, the same unresolved possibilities. They wondered whether a different choice, a different emphasis, a different moment might have altered everything. These thoughts were not productive, but they were persistent. They surfaced in quiet hours, uninvited, reminders that some experiences do not conclude so much as fade into a background hum. The case had become that hum, audible only when everything else fell silent. What the Sidney Cold case ultimately left behind was not an answer, but a challenge. It challenged assumptions about time, about memory, about the capacity of systems to deliver certainty long after events have passed. It forced a confrontation with limits, with the uncomfortable truth that some questions cannot be resolved without loss. The verdict, the appeals, the debates, all of these were attempts to impose order on something inherently resistant to it. And so the story continued, not as an active investigation or a public spectacle, but as a quiet, enduring presence. It lived in cautionary references, in professional hesitations, in private doubts. It was no longer about a single night in 1992, but about everything that followed, about the long shadow cast when violence meets time. As the case edged closer to becoming history rather than memory, one thing remained unchanged: the sense that something essential lay just beyond reach, not hidden by secrecy, but by the simple, stubborn fact that the past does not always yield to inquiry. It remains what it is, indifferent to our need for certainty, leaving us to decide how to live with what we cannot fully know. In the end, the case did not conclude so much as it thinned, stretched out over time until it became part of the background, a presence felt more than seen. The files remained where they always had been, boxed, labeled, their contents unchanged, waiting for a reason to be touched again. No dramatic revelation arrived to reorder the story, no final confession to silence the arguments. What remained was a residue of tension, the sense that something important had happened not only in 1992, but in the long years that followed, in the choices made under pressure, in the meanings assigned to fragments when certainty proved impossible. Those who still thought about the case learned to recognize its shape in other stories. They heard it in the language of new investigations, in the promises made by officials, in the cautious optimism of families waiting for answers. They recognized the pattern, the early confidence, the slow erosion of clarity, the hope invested in time itself. The Sidney case had taught them that time is not an ally, that it does not preserve truth so much as rearrange it. What survives is rarely pure. It is filtered through memory, through narrative, through the human need to make sense of harm. For the victim, there was no resolution in any meaningful sense. Her life remained defined publicly by its ending, her name bound permanently to a question mark. Those who loved her carried a quieter version of her forward, one that existed outside courtrooms and headlines. In private moments, they remembered details that never made it into evidence: small habits, ordinary kindnesses, the sound of her voice. These memories did not answer questions, but they resisted reduction. They were a reminder that the person at the center of the case was never just a case, never just a symbol in a debate about justice delayed. The convicted individual continued to live inside the outcome, their existence shaped by a decision that others debated, but they endured. Whether history would ever reinterpret their role was unknowable. Appeals had narrowed, options exhausted, the future defined more by acceptance than by possibility. The question of guilt or innocence became less a matter of public argument and more a private reckoning, lived day by day in a system that values finality over certainty. Whatever the truth, it no longer belonged solely to facts. It belonged to time. For the city, the case faded into a story told less often, its edges worn smooth by repetition. New generations encountered it as background, a reference in articles, a footnote in discussions about cold cases. They absorb its lesson without fully knowing its details. That lesson was not simple. It was not that justice always arrives, nor that it always fails. It was that justice, like memory, is constructed under constraint, shaped by what remains and by what is lost. The Sydney case offered no comfort on that point. It simply stood as evidence. Occasionally, someone would return to the file, not officially, but out of personal curiosity. They would read the transcripts, study the timelines, feel the familiar pull of unresolved mystery. For a moment, the case would feel alive again, charged with possibility. Then the weight of it would settle in. The gaps were still there. The ambiguities remained. The answers did not sharpen with attention. They blurred, and the reader would step back, understanding at last why the case had endured not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a problem to be lived with. What the long arc of the case revealed was not a single failure or success, but a series of compromises. Between speed and accuracy, between hope and restraint, between the desire to act and the fear of acting wrongly. These compromises are rarely visible in headlines, but they define outcomes nonetheless. In the Sydney case, they accumulated quietly, year after year, until the final shape of the story was less about what happened than about how decisions were made in its shadow. The phrase "cold case closed" lingered like an echo, official and incomplete. Closed to further investigation, perhaps. Closed to legal reconsideration mostly, but not closed in the way people mean when they talk about endings. Not closed in the minds of those who still felt its pull, who sensed that something essential remained unresolved. The words promised certainty. The reality delivered endurance. As time moved on, the case became less a wound and more a scar, visible only when attention was drawn to it, but always present beneath the surface. Scars tell stories without explaining them. They mark where something broke and healed imperfectly. The Sydney cold case became that kind of mark on the collective memory, a reminder that not every fracture can be realigned, that some breaks heal crooked and stay that way. In quiet moments, when the noise of argument had faded and the need to choose sides felt distant, what remained was a simpler, heavier truth. A life had been taken. A community had been changed. A family had been divided. Decades had passed without clarity strong enough to silence doubt. Everything else, the trials, the appeals, the commentary, had grown out of that original rupture. They were responses, not solutions. And so the story settled where it had always been heading, not toward resolution, but toward acceptance of uncertainty. Acceptance not as agreement, but as recognition of limits. The limits of memory. The limits of evidence. The limits of systems built to decide in a world that rarely offers clean answers. The Sydney cold case ended not with revelation, but with a question left standing, steady and unyielding. It asks whether truth must always be proven to matter, whether justice can exist without certainty, whether time clarifies or merely distances us from what we seek to understand. These questions do not belong to one case, one city, or one year. They belong to every unresolved story carried forward by those who refuse to forget. The night in 1992 remains unchanged, sealed in darkness, indifferent to interpretation. Everything that followed has been an attempt to reach into that darkness and pull something definitive into the light. What came back was partial, contested, human. And perhaps that is the final, unsettling note of the story, not that the case defied solution, but that it revealed how much we ask of answers, and how rarely the past is willing to give us what we want. The case does not end. It recedes. It becomes quieter, heavier, less visible but no less present. A reminder that some truths do not announce themselves, and some endings do not resolve. They simply remain, waiting in the background of our collective memory, cold, unresolved, and still, in their own way, alive. Even after everything that could be said had been said, after the verdicts, the appeals, the anniversaries quietly passing without comment, the case continued to assert itself in the smallest, most unexpected ways. A line in a report, a familiar phrase in a headline about a different crime. A pause in conversation when someone mentioned the year 1992. It was no longer dramatic, no longer urgent, but it was persistent, a low-frequency signal that refused to fade completely. The story had stopped moving forward, yet it had not stopped existing. It had simply changed how it occupied space. Those who revisited the case years later often did so alone, late at night, scrolling through archived articles or yellowed transcripts with the detached curiosity of distance. At first, the story seemed straightforward, even tidy compared to how it had once felt. Then the gaps revealed themselves. The missing hours. The assumptions quietly embedded in official language. The places where interpretation had hardened into fact without anyone noticing the transition. These readers felt the same unease others had felt before them, the slow realization that understanding the case required accepting its incompleteness. Many closed their browsers without resolution, unsettled not by what they had learned, but by what they could not. For those directly involved, time had dulled the sharpest edges, but had not erased the shape of the wound. Lives had continued, careers ended, children grown, parents buried. The case moved with them through these changes, adapting to new contexts without losing its core tension. It was referenced less often, but when it was, it carried a weight disproportionate to its words. A glance was enough. A silence spoke volumes. Everyone who had lived close to it knew the feeling, the sense that no matter how far one traveled from the event, it traveled too, packed neatly into memory. Within the justice system, the case became an unspoken benchmark. It hovered at the edge of decision-making, a reminder whispered in hallways and behind closed doors. When evidence felt thin, when timelines stretched too long, when pressure mounted to act rather than wait, someone would mention it obliquely, not by name, but by implication. And the room would shift. Shoulders tightened. Language grew more careful. The past exerted influence without re-entering the room. This was its quiet power, not instruction, but restraint. The idea of reopening the case one more time surfaced occasionally, usually prompted by technological optimism or renewed public curiosity. Each time, it was weighed and set aside. There was nothing new to test, nothing untouched to examine. The case had reached the edge of what it could offer. To reopen it again would not be investigation but repetition, an act of faith rather than reason. This recognition was difficult, especially for those who believed that persistence alone could overcome time. But time, in this case, had proven stronger. It had not erased the story, but it had fixed its boundaries. The house, now older still, existed quietly within those boundaries. Its walls had absorbed generations of ordinary life since the night that defined it. Laughter, arguments, renovations, repairs. None of these erased what had happened, but they diluted its presence, turning a site of rupture into something more ambiguous. People passed it without slowing, unaware of its history or aware but indifferent. This, too, was a form of resolution not moral or legal but social. The world moves forward, even when answers do not. From time to time, documentaries revisited the case, drawn by its contradictions. These retellings were careful, almost reverent, shaped by lessons learned from earlier excess. They avoided certainty, presented multiple perspectives, acknowledged doubt. And still, they could not escape the gravitational pull of narrative. Viewers wanted an ending. They wanted clarity. When it did not arrive, frustration followed, often directed not at the storytellers, but at the story itself. Why wouldn't it resolve? Why wouldn't it behave like fiction? The discomfort revealed something essential. Unresolved stories challenge not just understanding, but expectation. For younger audiences encountering the case for the first time, the reaction was different. Less emotional, more analytical. They approached it as a system problem rather than a personal tragedy. They asked about procedure, bias, standards of proof. They debated hypotheticals with detachment that older generations found unsettling. But this distance allowed new insights, not about guilt or innocence, but about process. About how systems respond to uncertainty. About how narratives form around absence. In this way, the case continued to teach, even as it resisted conclusion. Those closest to the original loss measured time differently. For them, the case was not a lesson or a symbol. It was a rupture that had never fully healed. They marked life events against it, before and after, as if it were a fault line running through their personal history. Even decades later, certain sounds, certain dates, could bring the past rushing back with surprising force. This was the part of the story that never made it into files or transcripts, the ongoing, quiet labor of living with something unresolved. The language around the case softened with age. Words like justice and closure were used less often, replaced by phrases like outcome and acceptance. This shift mattered. It reflected a collective adjustment, a lowering of expectations that felt, to some, like wisdom and to others like surrender. But it was neither. It was adaptation. A recognition that not every story offers the resolution we are trained to seek. Some offer only endurance. What lingered most powerfully was not the question of who did it, but the realization of how easily certainty can be constructed in its absence. How repetition, authority, and time can solidify interpretation into something that feels immutable. The case exposed this process slowly, almost gently, revealing it not as a failure of any one person, but as a human tendency. We want endings. We want coherence. When reality resists, we negotiate with it. In quiet professional circles, the case was sometimes described as finished but not complete. A phrase that captured its paradox perfectly. Finished, in that no further action was likely. Not complete, in that understanding remained fractured. This distinction mattered deeply to those who worked within systems built on finality. It forced a confrontation with the idea that decisions can be necessary without being definitive, that moving forward does not always require full understanding. As the decades extended further from 1992, the case's emotional temperature continued to cool, but its conceptual weight did not. It remained a reference point for discussions about time, memory, and responsibility. It reminded people that evidence